The Forgotten Town of Calico, October 22nd, 2022. Location: Calico, a small abandoned mining town in the Mojave Desert, California, October 22nd, 2022. I was somewhere in the middle of the Mojave, my car pushing through the endless stretch of desert highway, when the dashboard lights blinked and the engine stuttered. I pulled over, already cursing my luck. A wedding 2 hours away, I thought, and now, this. As I stepped out into the hot, still air, I noticed something odd, a small worn sign peeking through the dust-covered shrubs just beyond the road. Welcome to Calico. I'd never heard of Calico, but the letters, faded and nearly illegible, caught my eye. For a moment I debated waiting by the car, hoping someone might pass by, but curiosity pulled me in. The town sat quietly, maybe half a mile from the road, huddled against the backdrop of craggy red rock hills. As I approached, I could see it was unlike any of the abandoned places I'd seen in passing before. This place wasn't just empty. It looked untouched, as if it had been frozen in a single moment. The buildings were battered, their paint peeling in long, delicate curls. But there was something preserved about everything. It was as though the town was waiting for someone to return. I walked down what might have once been the main street, eyes skimming over storefronts and half-collapsed signs. A small diner with checkerboard floors still had plates and cutlery set out on a table near the window. A chipped coffee cup, perched as though a hand had set it down moments ago. Down the street, a single coat hung neatly on a chair in the sheriff's office, its edges yellowed from decades of desert sun. My footsteps echoed louder than they should have, each one stirring dust motes that hung in the air, almost reluctant to settle. It was the silence that got to me, an unnatural, heavy silence that seemed to absorb every sound. I checked my phone. No service. The time read 3:12, but then it flickered, jumping back and forth by a few minutes. I shook it, frowning, but the numbers wouldn't stabilize. Annoyed, I pocketed it and took another step forward. That's when I noticed them, faint footprints in the dust, trailing toward a set of small houses at the end of the street. They didn't belong to me. The prints looked recent, too recent for a town this old and empty. Like and subscribe for more videos. Tell me where you're from in the comments. Stepping further into Calico felt like peeling back layers of an old hidden memory. Every building, every street corner seemed to hold its own silent story, sealed under years of dust and desert sun. As I walked, a feeling crept over me. This wasn't just an abandoned town. It was a place deliberately left behind. I found myself drawn to a small general store with dusty glass windows. Inside, shelves stood neatly stocked, lined with faded cans and brittle bags, their labels still legible, but tinged with age. I picked one up, a can of peaches, and felt the crinkling of the paper under my fingers. It felt wrong, as if it had been left for me to find. I set it back carefully, trying to shake off the unease that had started to settle in my chest. Outside, the sun hung low, casting a strange, washed-out glow over the town. I kept moving, stepping past the old hotel, its sign swinging gently in the breeze. The letters faint but readable. Calico Inn. In the doorway, a broom leaned against the frame, tilted slightly, like someone had been about to sweep and had suddenly stopped. The windows were grimy, but I could make out the shape of chairs and tables inside, perfectly set as though waiting for guests. I decided to take a closer look at the sheriff's office, the one with the coat on the chair. As I stepped through the doorway, my shoes scuffed against the floor, leaving fresh tracks in the thick layer of dust. The coat, a faded brown with frayed edges, hung on the back of a sturdy wooden chair. On the desk sat a half-filled bottle of ink, a yellowed notepad beside it. the pages filled with dates and names. The last entry caught my eye, written hastily in slanted, uneven letters. October 15th, 1927. A chill crept up my spine. It felt too recent, too specific, for a town that seemed older than time itself. I turned, glancing around the room, and noticed a faint set of dusty handprints on the wall behind the desk, as though someone had leaned there, pushing themselves upright. The prints were small, delicate, almost childlike. Stepping back outside, I looked around, half expecting to see someone watching me. But the streets remained empty, the stillness weighing down on everything like a held breath. Back on the street, Calico felt different. What had seemed like a quaint, silent town now felt conscious, as though it was watching me, waiting. I told myself it was just the desert silence and the weight of the empty sky, but every instinct told me otherwise. I decided to take some pictures, thinking they might help clear my head when I looked back at them later. I pulled out my phone, hoping the camera would capture what I was seeing. But as I turned it on, the screen froze, then flickered. I watched in disbelief as the battery icon drained from 78% to 0 in a blink. The screen went black. Great, I thought, stranded in an eerie ghost town with no way to call for help. Annoyed, I shoved the phone back into my pocket and took another look around. That's when I saw them. Fresh footprints, faintly pressed into the dust, leading from the street and vanishing around the corner of an old wooden house. They weren't mine. They were too small and spaced closely together, like those of a child. Against my better judgment, I followed them. The prints led to the house's front door, which was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. A thick, musty smell filled the air, mixed with something faintly sweet, almost like the scent of old candy. The room was filled with relics of a family life frozen in time. A table set for dinner, dishes still stacked, a photograph on the wall of a smiling family. My gaze drifted to the center of the room where a small, worn doll sat in a rocking chair, its glassy eyes staring straight ahead. I approached it, my footsteps muffled by a faded rug. As I reached down to touch the doll, a chill washed over me. It was cold, far colder than the desert air outside. I looked up, and on the far wall, just above the table, I noticed a faint smudge, a child's handprint. A sudden sound behind me made me spin around, a quiet scraping like metal against wood. I froze, listening. The rocking chair had started moving, just slightly, back and forth, as though someone had nudged it. My heart pounded as I backed toward the door, my mind racing. This place wasn't just abandoned. It was inhabited by something that hadn't left and had no intention of letting me leave either. I stumbled out of the house, my pulse racing, only to find the streets of Calico empty, silent as ever. The footprints, the doll, the rocking chair, it all felt like a fever dream. I tried to steady myself, taking a few deep breaths of dry desert air. But something in me wouldn't let go of the feeling that I was intruding, that the town was aware of me. I told myself I would take one last look around and then leave, no matter what. That's when I noticed the schoolhouse. It sat at the end of the street, its small windows cracked and clouded with dust. Something about the place seemed different from the other buildings, almost alive, as if it had managed to hold on to a bit of the energy it once had. I walked up the wooden steps, my shoes creaking loudly. The door was slightly open, and I pushed it wider, stepping inside. Inside the schoolroom was a time capsule. Wooden desks sat in perfect rows, some with dusty books still lying open, yellowed pages brittle with age. An old globe sat on the teacher's desk, tilted at an awkward angle. I walked down the narrow aisle between the desks, my eyes scanning the small abandoned items. A single shoe under a desk, a half-melted candle on a window ledge, a chalkboard smeared with faint white marks. My gaze fell on one particular desk, front and center. A notebook lay open, its pages filled with neat, precise handwriting. I picked it up, glancing at the words. Each line was the same, repeated over and over. "Do not leave." The ink was dark, almost fresh. I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. As I set the notebook down, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. On the chalkboard, the faint smudges had taken on a new shape, as though words had been hurriedly erased, but hadn't quite vanished. Squinting, I could make out the words, "Stay until morning." A chill ran through me. Why would anyone write that? And why here, in a town that seemed to have emptied itself out overnight? I turned to leave, but as I did, something else caught my eye. A faint outline of tiny handprints on the dusty window next to the door. They were too high for a child to reach on their own, almost as if someone had lifted them up. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a ghost town. It was holding on to something, or someone, that had never left. The late afternoon sun dipped lower, casting Calico in a strange, eerie light that seemed to bleed into every crack and corner. The town looked surreal, as if painted in shades of bronze and burnt orange. I felt an overwhelming urge to leave, but the twisted layout of the streets made finding my way back impossible. Every turn I took only led me deeper, past buildings I swore I hadn't seen before. Calico was like a maze, and I was its trapped mouse. As I rounded a corner, I stopped dead in my tracks. At the far end of the street stood a man, or at least what looked like one. His silhouette was stark against the orange sky, tall and still, like a figure carved from stone. He was dressed in faded, dust-covered clothes. Work pants, a button-down shirt rolled to the elbows, and a battered hat that shielded his face from view. He looked like he'd stepped straight out of an old photograph. He raised one hand, but it wasn't a greeting. His fingers spread wide, palm facing me, like a warning. I froze, unsure if he could see me through the thickening shadows. We stared at each other, neither moving. I felt a chill seep into my bones, though the desert heat still clung to the air. Everything in me screamed to turn and run, but his gaze, unseen yet unmistakably felt, rooted me to the spot. The silence was suffocating. Finally, he lowered his arm and took a slow step forward. My heart hammered as he moved, each step deliberate, echoing faintly in the stillness. But then, with one blink, he was gone, vanished into thin air, as though he had never been there at all. I blinked, shaken, and stepped back, desperate to escape whatever strange grip Calico had on me. Turning around, I tried to retrace my path, but the street looked different. The buildings seemed closer together, their windows darker, their doors slightly ajar as if inviting me in. And worst of all, the road that had led me into Calico was gone, swallowed by the shifting sands. Frantically, I looked around, hoping for any landmark to guide me. But all I could see was Calico, endless and unchanging, as the sky began to dim into twilight. I was trapped. The town had closed itself around me, sealing me in its sunburned walls with nowhere to go. And somewhere, just out of sight, I felt the stranger watching, waiting. Dusk settled over Calico, casting it in hues of deep purple and burnt red, the kind of colors that only come before darkness falls completely. I clung to the fading light, hoping against hope that if I could just find my way out before nightfall, I'd be free. But every street I turned down seemed to lead me further in, twisting and looping in impossible ways. Buildings rearranged themselves as if guided by some unseen hand, hemming me in like walls of a labyrinth. The silence was complete, pressing down on me until even my own breathing seemed too loud, out of place. My heart raced as I stumbled past a row of houses, each one with its door slightly ajar, each one beckoning, almost expectant. As I hurried past, I swore I could see faint impressions of faces in the windows, watching with blank, empty stares. With every step, my panic grew, my mind racing in circles as wild as the streets around me. I tried to recall the layout, the path I'd taken earlier, but my memory betrayed me, slipping away like sand through my fingers. I couldn't shake the feeling that the town itself was bending and shifting, guiding me, keeping me lost. In my desperation, I ducked into one of the houses, hoping for a moment of shelter, a chance to collect myself. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of old wood and dust. The room was filled with a disturbing kind of order, an untouched scene of a life that had been abruptly abandoned. A table was set with a single plate, a fork and knife placed neatly beside it, waiting for a meal that would never come. I took a shaky breath, but then something caught my eye. Words scratched into the wall by the door, faint but unmistakable. "The town keeps you." The handwriting was jagged, desperate, as though carved with shaking hands. Just then I heard the faintest sound, a soft rustling, like fabric brushing against wood. My skin prickled as I looked around, spotting another set of fresh footprints in the dust, leading toward a small hallway at the back of the room. I took a step closer, drawn by an inexplicable need to see where they led. But the instant I did, the sound stopped. Then out of the silence, I heard a voice, clear as day, calling my name. I spun around, my heart slamming against my chest, but there was no one there. Only the empty, hollow rooms of Calico, waiting, as if knowing I had nowhere else to go. My heart pounded as I left the house, stepping back into Calico's darkened streets. The sun had long since vanished, leaving only the cold, creeping dark and a thin sliver of moon hanging overhead. Every building, every corner seemed alive, closing in around me. It was as if the town itself was watching, holding its breath, waiting. Desperation gnawed at me, and I found myself drawn to another house, hoping for answers, or maybe just a reprieve from the dark outside. Inside, the walls were stripped, empty except for pieces of furniture covered in dusty sheets. It was almost bare, except for something strange sticking out from the cracks in the walls. Slips of paper jammed between the wooden boards, as though hidden there in haste. I pulled one of the notes free, squinting at the faded ink. The words were scrawled, barely legible. "If you're reading this, you're already trapped." My hands shook as I took another paper, its edges worn from years of neglect. "The town pulls you in," it read, "and it doesn't let go." The message sent a chill down my spine. I yanked another note, my fingers trembling. This one was simpler, yet it struck me the hardest. "Do not trust the clock." I looked around the room and my eyes landed on an old ornate clock on the mantel. The hands ticked steadily, but the time felt wrong, as though it was deliberately lying. I checked my phone instinctively, only to find the time had once again begun to jump erratically, cycling backward and forward, as though taunting me. It dawned on me that there was no morning here, only a constant loop of time, trapping me in an endless twilight. Just then, I heard footsteps outside. Slow, steady, like someone pacing the street, circling the house. I froze, clutching one of the notes as the steps grew louder, pausing just outside the door. They were close enough that I could feel the vibrations through the floorboards, each footfall deliberate and heavy. The doorknob turned slowly, and I held my breath, my body tense, my mind racing, but the door never opened. After a few agonizing moments, the footsteps began again, this time moving away. I waited until the sound faded before I dared to breathe again. I clutched the slips of paper, these warnings from others who had once been trapped here, realizing I was part of a story that had played out many times before. Each new visitor adding their own desperate message to the walls of Calico, a place with no exit, no dawn. The footsteps finally faded, and I was left alone in the stifling silence of that abandoned room. Clutching the slips of paper, I knew one thing for certain. If I didn't leave Calico before the next dawnless day began, I would never leave at all. The town had taken others before me, leaving only their messages and warnings, and I could feel it circling around me, tightening its grip. I slipped out of the house, scanning the darkened street for any sign of the stranger, but it was empty, eerily still. The entire town lay blanketed in a strange half-light, neither night nor day, like a forgotten hour on the edge of reality. I glanced up at the sky, hoping to see some sign of the sun breaking through. To my relief, a faint glow on the horizon promised that morning was near. I just had to hold on a little longer. I began to walk, moving quickly but cautiously down the twisted streets, determined to find my way back to the main road. But Calico wasn't ready to let me go. The buildings seemed to rearrange themselves before my eyes, the streets stretching and bending in impossible ways. I passed the same landmarks again and again, the diner, the sheriff's office, the schoolhouse, each one more weathered and worn with each loop, as though time itself was unraveling around me. Panic clawed at me, and I broke into a run, every muscle in my body screaming for escape. The sky grew lighter, a sliver of pale blue overtaking the night, but the town closed in tighter, resisting, as if it could sense the dawn coming, and fought to keep me within its borders. Finally, I stumbled onto the familiar stretch of desert road. My car stood where I'd left it, covered in dust and nearly hidden, as though the desert itself was trying to erase it. I lunged for the door, my heart racing, and turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered, the dashboard flickering to life as I floored the accelerator. I didn't dare look back. I didn't need to. I could feel Calico watching, its streets twisting one last time as I drove away. As I sped toward the sunrise, a final chill settled over me. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the town shrinking behind me. But there was nothing there, just empty desert stretching out for miles, as if Calico had never existed at all. Yet, as I reached the highway, a faint whisper played in my mind, the words from those desperate notes lodged in my memory. The town keeps you. Like and subscribe for more videos. Tell me where you're from in the comments.